The shovel blade struck a stone, the jarring shock vibrating up the wooden handle, through Agnes's palms, and into the weary bones of her arms. She paused, her breath a white plume in the cool, subterranean air. Above her, slivers of late afternoon sun pierced the gaps in the old barn's floorboards, illuminating a swirling dance of dust motes and chaff. The air smelled of damp earth, of clay and deep soil, a scent that had become as familiar as her own skin. She worked the stone free with the edge of the blade, her movements economical and practiced, and tossed it onto a growing pile near the earthen wall. Each stone was a small victory against the prairie's unyielding geology. Her daughter, Martha, sat on an overturned bucket, her small hands diligently sorting smaller pebbles from a pail of excavated dirt, her face a mask of concentration. The child's presence was a quiet anchor in the long, laborious hours. She did not complain of the dark or the chill. She had learned her mother's language of necessity, of doing what must be done. This cavern, this deliberate wound in the earth beneath the derelict barn, was an act of defiance. Agnes remembered the last winter, the wind a shrieking beast that had threatened to peel the roof from their small cabin and scatter it across the plains. She remembered huddling with Martha, the blankets piled high, listening to the very timbers of their home groan in protest. Never again. This earth would hold them. It would be their shield. A shadow fell across the wide opening where a ramp would eventually be built. Still at it, Agnes? The voice of Mr. Finch, their closest neighbor, was thick with a kind of weary amusement. He remained on his horse, looking down into the pit as one might observe a badger digging a new set. You mean to bury yourself before the ground freezes? Agnes straightened her back, the muscles pulling in a dull, familiar ache. She did not waste energy on a full reply. Preparing, she said, her voice even. Preparing for what? The end of the world. He chuckled, a dry, rustling sound. A woman's place is in a proper house, not a hole in the ground. It ain't natural. He saw the two cows, Daisy and Buttercup, tethered nearby, their warm breath misting in the air. You can't mean to keep livestock down there with you. The smell alone. He shook his head, a gesture of finality, of dismissing her as a lost cause. It's your husband's passing that's done this. Clouded your judgment. Agnes picked up her shovel. The weight of it felt good in her hands, solid and real. She looked not at Finch, but at the wall of earth she still had to move. The judgment of a widow is her own to keep, Mr. Finch. Her tone was not sharp, but it was firm, a door quietly closed. He lingered a moment longer, then clicked his tongue and turned his horse, riding away without another word. The sound of the hooves faded, leaving only the soft scrape of Martha's trowel and the steady, rhythmic slice of Agnes's shovel biting into the earth. The construction became a study in leverage and patience. Agnes had no brute strength to spare, so she relied on ingenuity. She had traded her late husband's good pocket watch for a load of pine timbers from the mill, a transaction that had earned her more than a few pitying glances in town. Now, those timbers were her salvation. She learned the geometry of support, how to brace the tons of earth above them, sinking the posts deep and wedging the crossbeams with a precision born of terror at the thought of being buried alive. The rhythmic thud of her mallet against the wood echoed in their cavern, a sound of creation in the deep quiet. Martha helped by holding the lantern steady, its golden light casting their long, dancing shadows against the raw dirt walls. The child learned to identify the different timbers by their scent and texture, her small fingers tracing the grain of the wood as her mother worked. Getting the cows down was the greatest challenge. The ramp had to be gentle in its slope but strong in its construction. Agnes spent 2 days on it, digging it out, packing the surface, and lining it with planks for better footing. Daisy, the older of the two, balked at the entrance, her large brown eyes wide with suspicion, her soft moo a low question. Agnes did not force her. She simply stood at the bottom of the ramp with a bucket of sweet oats, her voice a low, calming murmur. She spoke to the animal not as a beast of burden, but as a partner in their shared survival. It was Martha who finally coaxed her, walking back up the ramp to gently pat Daisy's flank. her childish trust seeming to communicate that the strange, dark place was safe. Buttercup followed with less protest. Their new home was sectioned with a clear logic. A raised wooden platform at the far end served as their living quarters, with 2 simple cots and a small, well-vented stove. The center was the cow's domain, a wide space with deep beds of clean straw and a stone-lined channel for waste that led to a deeper sump pit. The area nearest the ramp was the dairy, with a heavy table for her pails and churn, and shelves dug directly into the earthen wall where she would cure her cheeses. The air was the most critical element. She had dug 2 shafts at opposite ends, reinforcing them with clay pipe bought from Mr. Gable's store and capping them above ground with small, louvered hoods to keep the snow out while allowing the air to circulate. It was a lung for their subterranean world, a system that drew the warm, animal-scented air out and pulled the cold, clean air in. It was a constant, living breath. Life settled into a new rhythm, dictated not by the sun and moon, but by the soft glow of the lantern and the needs of the animals who shared their shelter. Mornings began with the scrape of the milking stool on the packed earth and the warm, familiar scent of the cows. Agnes would rest her forehead against Daisy's flank, the animal's solid presence a comfort in the pre-dawn dark. The rhythmic pull and squeeze of her hands was a meditation, the twin streams of milk hissing into the metal pail a sound of sustenance, of life persisting against the odds. Martha, bundled in a thick wool sweater, would be tasked with feeding the cows their portion of grain, her small face serious as she measured out the scoops. Afterward, the work of the dairy began. While Agnes strained the fresh milk through clean cheesecloth, Martha learned to turn the crank on the butter churn. It was a task perfectly suited to her, a steady, repetitive motion that she could manage, her small arm working with a determined rhythm. "Slow and steady, little bird," Agnes would say, her voice soft in the enclosed space. The butter likes a patient hand. They found a quiet harmony in their shared tasks. The underground space, which the townsfolk imagined as a damp, foul-smelling tomb, was in fact a place of focused industry and surprising warmth. The body heat from the 2 large animals kept the chill at bay, creating a stable, tempered environment that was cool in the summer and, Agnes hoped, defensible against the deepest winter cold. Once a week, she would make the trip into the small settlement for supplies. Emerging from the ramp into the bright, open world always felt like a brief shock to the senses. The sky seemed impossibly vast, the wind more biting. In Gable's mercantile, she was an object of quiet curiosity. The other women, in their calico dresses and neat bonnets, would fall silent when she entered, their conversations resuming in whispers as she made her way to the counter. "More salt, Agnes?" Mr. Gable asked one afternoon, his eyes kind but questioning as he weighed out a heavy sack. "And another 2 tins of oil. You must be planning for a long winter." Agnes simply nodded, placing a small wheel of freshly made cheese on the counter, wrapped in clean cloth. "A trade for the salt." Mr. Gable unwrapped a corner, his eyebrows rising at the pale, firm texture. He cut a small piece with his pocket knife and tasted it. His expression shifted from curiosity to grudging respect. "That's a fine cheese. A very fine cheese." He looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time. "You and the little one, you're managing all right down there?" "We are not down there," Agnes corrected him gently, her dignity a quiet shield. "We are inside. We are safe." She took her salt and her oil, leaving the shop with her head held high, the whispers of the other patrons like the rustling of dry leaves behind her. The signs began subtly, as they always did on the prairie. It was not one thing, but a confluence of small, easily missed details, a language Agnes had learned to read out of necessity. The sky, for days, had held a strange, bruised quality at the horizon, a yellow-gray light that seemed to bleach the color from the autumn grasses. The usual flocks of migrating birds had vanished overnight, an abrupt silence falling where there had been the clamor of their passage. The air itself felt different, thin and sharp in the lungs, carrying a deep, resonant cold that had nothing to do with the time of day. One evening, as she secured the barn doors above, she stopped and watched the sunset. It was a spectacle of violent, feverish color, streaks of orange and purple bleeding across the sky as if the heavens themselves were wounded. But beneath the beauty, she felt a deep and unsettling stillness. The wind had died completely, and the silence that remained was not peaceful but expectant, the held breath before a scream. She knew it in her bones, a certainty that went deeper than logic. This was not just the coming of winter. This was something else, a storm of a different magnitude. The next day, her movements took on a new, quiet urgency. There was no panic, only a methodical and comprehensive sweep of preparations. She sent Martha down into the shelter with the last of the kindling, instructing her to stack it neatly by the small stove. She herself cleared the ramp of any loose tools and packed dirt firmly along its edges to prevent drift. She climbed a ladder to the barn's hayloft and pushed down bale after bale, dragging them to the top of the ramp, creating a thick, insulating wall just inside the main doors. She checked the 2 ventilation pipes, ensuring their louvered caps were free of debris and angled away from the north, the direction from which the worst winds always came. Her final trip into town was brief and purposeful. The townspeople were bundled in coats, their conversations full of complaints about the sudden, bitter cold, but no one seemed to share her deep sense of foreboding. They saw a cold snap. She saw a siege. She bought a large bag of oats from Mr. Gable, her last remaining coins spread on the counter. He looked at her, then at the darkening sky outside his window. "The old-timers say a sky like that is a bad omen," he remarked quietly, handing her the sack. "Stay safe, Agnes." It was a simple kindness, but it felt significant. Back at the barn, she led the cows from their small fenced paddock for the last time. They went down the ramp willingly now, associating the space with warmth and food. Once they were settled, Agnes took a deep breath of the thin, freezing air and pulled the heavy ramp cover, a massive plank door she had built, into place. It fell with a solid, echoing thud. From inside, she and Martha slid the heavy wooden bar across it, sealing them in. The world outside was gone. A low moan began in the distance, the first voice of the wind. The storm did not arrive. It descended. It fell upon the prairie not as snow, but as a solid, roaring wall of white. The sound was the first thing they noticed, a low hum that vibrated through the earth itself, growing steadily into a deep, guttural howl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was the sound of a world being unmade. Above them, the old barn groaned, its timbers shrieking under the immense, unceasing pressure of the wind. Dust and bits of dried straw sifted down through the floorboards, a fine powder that settled on their hair and shoulders. Martha's eyes were wide, fixed on the wooden ceiling as if she expected it to collapse at any moment. Agnes reached out and placed a steadying hand on her daughter's shoulder. "We are deep, little bird," she said, her voice calm and clear, a small point of stillness in the maelstrom of sound. "The wind cannot reach us here. The earth is holding us." Their life continued, a stubborn refusal to acknowledge the chaos reigning just a few feet above their heads. In the warm, steady glow of the lantern, Agnes milked Daisy. The familiar routine was an anchor. The hiss of milk into the pail, the cow's placid chewing, the soft shuffle of her hooves in the straw. These were the sounds of their small, protected world. The fury outside was an abstraction, a story told by the trembling ground and the muffled roar that never ceased. They ate their meal of oat porridge and fresh milk at the small table, the lantern light carving out an intimate circle of warmth and safety. The air was thick with the scent of hay, warm animals, and damp earth, a smell not of confinement, but of life. After eating, Martha took out her reader and began to sound out the words, her small, clear voice a counterpoint to the storm's deep bass. Agnes listened as she began the slow, methodical process of making cheese, heating the milk over their small stove, adding the rennet and waiting for the curd to set. Her hands moved with a practiced, unhurried grace. Each completed task was a small victory, a testament to the foresight that others had mocked. Time became fluid, measured not by a sun they could not see, but by the rhythm of their chores, milking, churning, cooking, sleeping. The cows were their clock. The world had shrunk to the dimensions of their shelter, a space no bigger than a large room, yet it felt like a kingdom. Here they were not a widow and her child, pitted and dismissed. They were sovereign. Agnes would occasionally pause her work and simply watch her daughter, safe and warm. Her head bent over a book, and a feeling of profound, earned satisfaction would wash over her. They had dug into the heart of the prairie, and in its embrace, they had found a fortress. 3 days passed, or what Agnes measured as 3 days by the cycles of sleep and work. The storm's voice changed in pitch and intensity, sometimes rising to a deafening shriek, other times falling to a steady, deep-throated roar, but it never ceased. A fine, persistent vibration hummed through the packed earth of the walls, a constant reminder of the elemental war being waged above. They learned to live within the sound, to speak and think through it. The shelter, once a project, had become their entire universe. Its routines were the laws of physics that governed their existence. The morning and evening milking, the steady turning of the churn, the careful stoking of the small stove. These were the celestial mechanics of their world. Agnes found a strange peace in the relentless labor. There was no room for abstract fear, only for the immediate, tangible needs of the present moment. Her focus narrowed to the heat of the stove, the texture of the cheese curd, the warmth of the cow's hide beneath her hands. She noticed the small ways the shelter had come alive. Condensation would gather on the coldest parts of the earthen walls, tracing dark, wet patterns like ancient maps. The air, though constantly circulating through her clever vents, was thick and organic, a mixture of animal breath, warm milk, and the faint, clean scent of the burning pine kindling. It was the scent of their survival. Martha, too, had adapted with the unthinking resilience of childhood. The roar of the blizzard became the backdrop to her life, a sound as natural as the wind in the summer grasses had once been. She created a small world for herself on the wooden platform, lining up pebbles as a makeshift family and whispering stories to them. She helped her mother without prompting, her small hands wiping down the milking pails or fetching a new cloth. The hardship was maturing her, honing her into a smaller, quieter version of her mother's practicality. One evening, a new sound cut through the storm's drone. A tremendous, splintering crack from directly above, followed by a heavy, resonant thud that shook the entire cavern. Dust rained down in a thick cloud. Martha cried out, scrambling to her mother's side. Agnes held her tight, her own heart hammering against her ribs. She stared up at the ceiling, at the solid timbers she had placed herself, and whispered a prayer to her own foresight. "It's all right," she murmured, her voice a low anchor in the child's fear. "It was just the barn settling. The wood is strong. The earth is stronger." She did not truly know what the sound had been. A falling beam, a collapsing section of the roof. But she projected a certainty she did not entirely feel. For the rest of that night, she did not sleep, but sat with the lantern turned low, listening, her senses attuned to every groan of the structure above, every shift in the earth around them. The shelter was their shield, but she was its keeper. The change, when it came, was not a sudden event but a gradual subtraction of sound. On what Agnes guessed was the 5th day, she noticed the wind's roar had softened, its furious, high-pitched shriek giving way to a sustained, mournful howl. Hours later, that howl had diminished to a low moan that seemed to be retreating into the distance. By the time they woke from their next sleep, there was only silence. It was a profound, unearthly quiet that felt heavier and more absolute than the noise it had replaced. The familiar vibration in the walls was gone. The barn above was still. Even the cows seemed to sense the change, their chewing softer, their movements more subdued. "It's over," Martha whispered, her voice sounding loud in the stillness. Agnes nodded, though a new kind of apprehension was coiling in her stomach. They had survived the siege. Now they had to see the battlefield. The task of unsealing their world was daunting. The massive plank door over the ramp was barred from their side, but she knew tons of snow must be pressing against it from the other. She handed Martha a small shovel. "We'll start at the top. Scrape away any dirt or ice that might be sealing the edges together." They worked by lantern light, their breath pluming in the cold air that now seemed to seep more insistently from the entrance. Finally, Agnes put her shoulder to the heavy crossbar and heaved. It groaned in protest but did not move. She took a breath, planted her feet, and pushed again, every muscle in her back and legs straining. With a great, screeching complaint of wood against wood, the bar slid free. Now came the true test. "Stand back," she told Martha. She took a deep grip on the edge of the plank door and pulled. It was like trying to move a mountain. It gave not an inch. She tried the other side, bracing her feet against the packed earth of the ramp and pulling with all her weight. A fine trickle of snow fell from a crack at the top. She had moved it just barely. For the next hour, she fought the door, a battle of inches. She would heave it open a fraction, and a cascade of packed snow would fall into the gap, which she and Martha would then have to shovel away before trying again. Finally, with a last, desperate pull, the door swung inward enough for her to squeeze through. She emerged not into a familiar world, but into a foreign landscape of blinding, impossible white. The light was so intense it was painful, and she shielded her eyes with a hand. Snow was piled in immense, sculpted drifts that buried everything. The barn itself was half swallowed by a mountain of white that had swept against its northern wall, reaching nearly to the eaves. The sound she had heard had been a massive drift collapsing onto a section of the lean-to roof, which now sagged at a dangerous angle. The world was silent, beautiful, and utterly impassable. The sheer scale of the snow was a new kind of prison. The drifts were not soft powder but were packed as hard as stone by the relentless wind, their surfaces carved into frozen waves and cornices. The air was frigid, so clean and cold it felt sharp in her throat. Her first task was survival's most basic imperative: air. She took the largest shovel and began the arduous work of digging out their 2 ventilation pipes. It was brutal labor. The snow was heavy, and each shovelful had to be tossed high onto the surrounding drift. Her muscles, accustomed to the steady work of the dairy, screamed in protest against this new, violent effort. Within an hour, her back was a knot of fire and her breath came in ragged, painful gasps. But she did not stop. She dug with a methodical fury, her mind focused on the image of Martha's face, on the warm, living air they needed to breathe. By midday, she had cleared them both, 2 small, vital nostrils opening their buried home to the sky. Her next challenge was the ramp. Clearing a path to the main barn doors would take days. She looked up at the hayloft, knowing their supply of feed for the cows was dwindling. A new plan formed, born of the same practical logic that had led her underground. She went back into the shelter and returned with an axe and a small handsaw. Directly above the cow's enclosure, she began to cut through the barn's floorboards. It was slow, awkward work, sawing upwards, sawdust raining down on her face. But after an hour, she had created a rough, square opening into the barn above. A ladder, fashioned from leftover timber, gave her access. The interior of the barn was a landscape of its own, filled with dunes of snow that had blown in through every crack and knothole. But the hay in the loft was mostly dry. She could now drop bales down directly to the cows, bypassing the impassable ramp entirely. It was 2 days later when she heard the sound of shouting. She climbed the ladder into the barn and saw 2 figures struggling through the massive drifts near her property line. It was Mr. Finch and Mr. Gable, moving slowly, their faces red with cold and exertion. They stopped dead when they saw her emerge from the barn, shovel in hand. They stared at the wisp of smoke curling from her stovepipe, which she had also dug out, and at the cleared ventilation caps. Finch's mouth hung open slightly. "Agnes? We thought." No one could have. He was speechless. Gable found his voice first, his eyes wide with a respect that bordered on awe. "We came to check, to see if, well, the whole settlement is buried. We're losing livestock." The Hendersons' roof collapsed. He looked from her to the barn, then back again. "How did you?" Agnes did not offer a long explanation. She simply leaned on her shovel, the weariness of the past week etched on her face but her eyes clear and steady. "We were safe," she said. "The ground held us." The men's initial shock slowly gave way to a dawning understanding. They walked around the small, cleared area, their gazes lingering on the sturdy, snow-dusted hoods of the ventilation shafts. Mr. Finch, a man not given to apologies, ran a hand over his jaw, his expression a mixture of disbelief and profound reassessment. "All this time," he said, his voice low, directed more at himself than at her. "We all thought you were digging a grave." He looked toward the barn, then at the small plume of smoke rising from the stovepipe, a clear sign of life and warmth within the frozen landscape. "Turns out you were building an ark." Agnes accepted his words with a simple, dignified nod. There was no triumph in her posture, no hint of "I told you so." The situation was too grave for petty victories. Mr. Gable, ever the practical merchant, was already assessing the implications. "We've lost half the town's milk cows," he stated, his tone grim. "Froze in the fields or trapped in collapsed barns. What little we have is being saved for the infants. My own stores are running low. People are getting desperate." It was then that the true, ironic weight of her foresight settled over them all. The mocked, unnatural, underground dairy was not just intact. It was operational. Her 2 cows, Daisy and Buttercup, warm and well-fed in their subterranean stall, were now the most valuable livestock in the entire county. They were not just animals. They were a source of life in a community that was slowly freezing and starving. "My cows are well," Agnes said simply. The statement hung in the frigid air, laden with meaning. It was an answer to a question they hadn't yet dared to ask. Mr. Finch looked at her directly, his earlier condescension replaced entirely by a raw, humble plea. "Agnes," he began, his voice strained, "my wife is trying to make soup out of melted snow and dried beans. We have children. The whole town has children." He did not need to finish the sentence. The request was clear. They were not asking for a handout. They were asking for a miracle. She thought of the whispers in the mercantile, the pitying looks, the certainty in their voices that she was a foolish woman driven mad by grief. And then she thought of Martha, safe and warm below, her belly full of fresh milk and porridge. She had not done this for them. She had done it for her child. But now her child's safety could extend to theirs. "I have milk," she said, her voice steady and sure. "And I can make cheese. You will need to help me clear the path to town. And I will need hay for my animals." "A fair trade." Mr. Gable nodded immediately, a look of immense relief flooding his face. "Anything, Agnes. Whatever you need." The news of Agnes's dairy spread through the snowbound settlement like a prayer answered. What had been a story of a widow's strange obsession became a legend of improbable survival and foresight. The path from her barn to the town, a project that would have taken her weeks alone, was cleared in 2 days by a determined crew of men led by Finch and Gable. They worked with a quiet, focused energy, their shovels biting into the massive drifts, their faces grim with the knowledge of what was at stake. When the path was finally clear, Agnes made her first delivery. She loaded 2 large milk cans onto a small sled, along with several wheels of the cheese she had made during the storm. Martha, bundled so thoroughly that only her eyes were visible, insisted on coming with her. As they pulled the sled into the town's single street, people emerged from their homes, their faces pale and drawn. A hush fell over them. They stared at the milk cans as if they were seeing a mirage. Mrs. Finch was the first to approach, her face streaked with tears. She held out a small pitcher with trembling hands. "My boy," she whispered. "He hasn't had a full stomach in a week." Agnes ladled the rich, creamy milk into the pitcher, the simple act feeling as momentous as any ceremony. One by one, others came forward, holding out jars, pots, and buckets. They brought with them what little they could offer in trade. A handful of dried apples, a few precious candles, a sack of potatoes dug from a cellar. Agnes conducted the exchanges with a calm and equitable grace. She was not a savior dispensing charity. She was a producer, a vital part of a community that was now relearning the meaning of interdependence. The women who had once whispered behind her back now met her eyes with expressions of profound gratitude and respect. They saw not a madwoman, but a protector, a mother who had shielded her own and, in doing so, had created a surplus of life to share. Mr. Gable set up a formal system at his mercantile, ensuring the milk was distributed fairly, with the youngest children getting the first shares. Agnes's cheese became as valuable as currency, a source of protein and fat in a diet that had been reduced to meager grains. Her subterranean shelter, the source of so much speculation, was now spoken of with a kind of reverence. It was no longer Folly's Hole, as some had derisively called it. It was the dairy, and Agnes, the quiet widow who talked to her cows and dug in the dirt, had become the unshakable bedrock of their town's survival. Her resilience had become their own.